The smell hits Private First Class Raymond Keller before anything else. Cordite and damp earth and something sharp like burnt rubber. He's crouched behind a shot-up hedgerow, maybe 200 yards back from the action, splicing wire that some tank track severed an hour ago, and he keeps looking up because he can't help it. October 1944, somewhere near Aachen. The pillbox ahead of him looks like a concrete tumor growing out of the hillside, gun slit facing the American line, and infantry from the 28th Division are doing exactly what infantry does, firing at the front, pinning whatever's inside. But behind the bunker, 3 men in the same olive drab as everyone else are walking, not running, not diving for cover, walking like they're heading to mess. Keller squints through the smoke and sees they're carrying something, not rifles, something heavy and hosed. The infantry keeps pouring fire at the front aperture. The 3 engineers reach the back wall. One of them moves to the steel door, does something Keller can't quite see. Then all 3 step to the side and crouch. What happens next makes no sound he can hear over the firefight. Just a flash, a puff of concrete dust. The door, that steel door built to stop a Sherman, swings open like someone forgot to lock it. The engineers don't go in. They wait. 4 seconds. 5. A white cloth pokes out, then hands. Then a German sergeant, blinking in the daylight, followed by 7 more men who look like they just woke up from the wrong kind of dream. The infantry at the front stops firing. The whole assault took maybe 3 minutes from first shot to surrender. The bunker that was supposed to anchor this section of Adolf Hitler's vaunted Westwall, the fortification that Nazi propaganda promised would hold for 1,000 years, just cracked open like a tin can. Keller goes back to his splice. But the image stays with him. 3 men with no rifles taking a position that should have cost a platoon. Keller didn't know, and neither did the infantry watching that morning, and neither did the Germans inside that bunker until the moment it happened. The engineers had figured out something that made bravery almost irrelevant. The German defenders of the Siegfried Line had built their bunkers to resist frontal assault. Thick concrete, interlocking fields of fire, steel doors that could stop rifle rounds all day. Every tactical assumption pointed forward, but somewhere in the American chain of supply and ingenuity, someone had developed a weapon that made all of that engineering, years of planning, millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, into a trap that locked defenders inside with their own death. One bunker near Aachen tells a larger story. American engineers cracked open hundreds of positions that were supposed to be impregnable, and German bunker crews, trained to fight to the last round, chose surrender the moment they realized what was happening behind them. Every year, there are fewer people left who remember what those engineers carried, what it smelled like, what it did to men who thought concrete walls meant safety. A like and subscribe. That's how we keep these stories from disappearing. If your grandfather was in the ETO, if he ever mentioned the Westwall or the pillboxes or the engineers, tell us about him in the comments. The German soldiers who surrendered that morning later told interrogators they'd been defenseless from the moment the door blew. One NCO captured near Stolberg put it plainly in his debrief. We could not turn around. The guns point one way. When they came from behind, we had nothing. The answer lies in what those engineers were actually carrying, and why the men inside those bunkers never saw it coming. Colonel Benjamin Grubb Gruber drops the reconnaissance folder on his desk at SHAEF headquarters in August 1944 and reaches for his coffee. The folder contains aerial photographs of the Siegfried Line, what the Germans call the Westwall, taken by P-38s flying at 23,000 feet. The photographs show concrete, miles of it. Pillboxes, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, bunker complexes stretching from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. Gruber's assessment goes up the chain in 3 days. His conclusion, obsolete. The logic seemed sound at the time. France had built the Maginot Line. The Germans had walked around it. Fixed fortifications belonged to 1914, not 1944. American air power and armor had just torn through Normandy's hedgerows and raced across France faster than anyone expected. Why would concrete boxes stop what panzer divisions couldn't? Intelligence estimates in late summer put the Siegfried Line's combat value somewhere between minimal and propaganda. One G2 report from First Army described the fortifications as dated in conception and unlikely to present significant delay to mechanized forces. The word delay, not stop, not even challenge, delay. Frontline commanders saw it differently. Major General Lewis Craig, commanding the 9th Infantry Division, sent a memo through channels in early September warning that his men would need specialized equipment to crack fortified positions. The memo requested additional engineer support, demolition supplies, and time to train assault teams. The response came back in the form of operational orders. Continue advance, maintain tempo, exploit enemy disorganization. The assumption at SHAEF was simple. German forces were broken. The Wehrmacht had lost 200,000 men in the Falaise pocket alone. Fuel shortages had stranded entire panzer divisions. The Luftwaffe couldn't contest Allied air superiority over its own territory. Under these conditions, who would man the bunkers? With what ammunition? For how long? This assumption contained a fatal miscalculation. The Germans had been preparing the Westwall since 1938. Over 14,000 concrete positions stretched across 400 miles of frontier. The bunkers weren't Maginot copies. They were smaller, cheaper, designed for interlocking defense rather than isolated strongpoints. Each position covered its neighbors. Fields of fire overlapped. The concrete was between 4 and 8 feet thick in most cases, poured with reinforcing steel that American artillery would find distressingly resistant. And the men who would occupy those positions were already arriving. Volk's Grenadier divisions, hastily assembled but stiffened with Eastern Front veterans. Fortress battalions made up of soldiers too old or too wounded for mobile warfare, but perfectly capable of manning a machine gun behind 8 feet of concrete. Local Volkssturm units who knew the ground because they'd grown up on it. By mid-September, 63 German divisions stood between the advancing Americans and the Rhine. Not all of them were full strength. Many were under-equipped, but they were there, and they had concrete walls to hide behind. The first American units hit the Westwall near Aachen on September 11th, 1944. What happened next made intelligence look foolish and made frontline commanders look prophetic. Infantry companies that expected to push through dated fortifications found themselves pinned by interlocking machine gun fire from positions they couldn't see. Tank destroyers fired at pillbox apertures and watched their rounds ricochet. Artillery barrages that would have shattered field fortifications barely chipped the concrete. One battalion from the 3rd Armored Division lost 22 tanks in a single afternoon trying to force a gap that intelligence had marked as lightly defended. The September shock wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. American soldiers who had chased a beaten enemy across France suddenly faced an enemy who had stopped running and who had built himself a concrete shell to fight from. Washington had dismissed the Westwall as propaganda. The men dying in front of it knew better. And somewhere in the supply chain, the solution was already moving forward, carried in canisters that weighed 40 pounds and smelled like nothing the Germans had ever encountered. The aperture measures exactly 20 centimeters by 40. That's the firing slit on a Regelbau Type 10 bunker, 8 inches by 16, if you want it in American. Small enough that a direct artillery hit on the opening itself would be a matter of pure luck. Large enough to fit the barrel of an MG-42 and sweep a 90-degree arc of ground that any attacker would have to cross. The Germans built 11,000 of these things, not identical. Over 100 different Regelbau designs existed, from simple machine gun nests to multi-room command bunkers with living quarters and ammunition storage. But the principle stayed constant. Small target, big field of fire, concrete thick enough to laugh at anything short of a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bomb. The positioning made frontal assault essentially suicidal. Bunkers sat low against hillsides, often with only the aperture visible above ground level. Camouflage netting and local vegetation covered the rest. From the American side, a pillbox often looked like nothing at all until it started killing people, and by then, 3 more positions had you in their overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank defenses ran in belts. The Dragon's Teeth, pyramidal concrete obstacles arranged in rows 5 and 6 deep, could stop a Sherman dead, not by destroying it, by channeling it into kill zones where anti-tank guns waited in their own hardened positions. Engineers could blow gaps through the teeth, but that took time. Time measured in the number of men the covering bunkers could shoot while you worked. Behind the teeth came the mines, not scattered, systematic. German engineers had laid over 400,000 Tellerminen and S-mines in prepared patterns along likely approach routes. Soldiers called the S-mine Bouncing Betty. Step on the prong. The charge launches the mine 3 feet into the air, then detonates at waist height. One mine could wound a dozen men in a cluster, and behind the mines came the bunkers, row after row, each one sighted to cover the dead ground of the one in front. Take out a pillbox, and 3 more had your assault team in their sights. The German defensive doctrine was simple. Make the Americans pay for every 100 yards. Make them pay until they couldn't afford it anymore. American artillery tried first. The standard approach to fortifications, mass fires, suppress, assault. It worked in North Africa. It worked in Sicily. Against 4 feet of reinforced concrete, it produced a lot of noise and not much else. One after-action report from the 28th Infantry Division documented a 90-minute barrage against a single bunker complex near Monschau. 155 mm howitzers, over 200 rounds. When the infantry finally advanced, the bunkers opened fire as if nothing had happened. The only visible damage, scoring on the concrete and some displaced camouflage netting. The guns inside were fine, so were the crews. Tank destroyers fared no better. The M10 carried a 3-inch gun that could punch through Panther armor at reasonable range. Against a pillbox aperture, the geometry worked against them. A direct hit on that 8 by 16-inch slot required precision that combat conditions rarely allowed. Rounds that struck the surrounding concrete did nothing. Rounds that missed by inches still did nothing. The Westwall wasn't sophisticated. It didn't need to be. Concrete, overlap in fire, terrain advantage, and defenders who didn't have to move. That combination had stopped armies before. The Germans knew it. Their defensive manuals from 1944 emphasized the same point. Hold position, conserve ammunition, force the enemy to come to you across open ground. American commanders, watching their casualty lists grow, understood something Washington had missed. This wasn't a matter of morale or momentum. It wasn't about the broken state of German forces. This was a problem of physics, and physics didn't care how fast you'd crossed France. Sergeant Harold Meacham leads his squad across 40 yards of open ground near Stolberg on September 14th and watches 3 of his men go down before anyone fires back. The MG-42 opens up from a slit he never saw. Meacham hits the dirt, crawls behind a shell crater, and starts doing math he doesn't want to do. 40 yards to the bunker, maybe 6 seconds at a dead sprint. The gun cycles at 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds per second, 120 rounds in 6 seconds. Nobody makes that run. His radio man calls for mortar support. The 81s drop 12 rounds in a rough circle around the pillbox. Meacham watches the impacts through binoculars. Smoke, dirt, fragments pinging off concrete. When the smoke clears, the aperture is still there, still dark, still waiting. Bazooka team moves up. 2 men, 1 tube, 3 rockets. The first round hits 6 inches left of the slit and gouges a crater the size of a dinner plate in the concrete. The second round hits the steel door on the side and bounces, actually bounces, before detonating 10 feet away and showering fragments into empty air. The third round goes wide. The MG-42 fires again. The bazooka team doesn't make it back. Meacham's after-action report, filed 3 days later, uses language that got edited before it went up the chain. The original draft survives in a file at the National Archives. His phrase, "Position cannot be taken by infantry action alone." That was 1 bunker, 1 squad, 1 morning. Across the First Army front in mid-September, the pattern repeated with grinding consistency. Rifle companies advanced on fortified positions using tactics that had worked in France: fire and maneuver, suppress the enemy, close the distance, assault the objective. In France, the enemy could be suppressed and flanked. Here, the enemy sat behind 4 feet of reinforced concrete with a firing slit 8 inches tall. Grenades proved worthless. A bunker door flush against the wall offered no gap to wedge a frag into. Toss a grenade at the aperture, and the angle sent it rolling off the concrete slope. Even a direct throw through the slit, a physical impossibility under fire, faced the interior baffles the Germans had installed to deflect exactly that attempt. Flamethrowers worked in theory. Get close enough to the aperture, hit it with burning fuel, fill the interior with fire. In practice, close enough meant 10 to 15 feet. Flamethrower operators carrying 70 pounds of equipment didn't survive the approach across open ground, swept by interlocking machine gun fire. The casualty math became obscene. 1 regimental commander in the 4th Infantry Division tracked his losses against fortified positions during the 3rd week of September. 18 bunkers assaulted, 11 taken, 7 still in German hands, 412 casualties. That's 23 dead or wounded per bunker captured. A bunker typically held 6 to 10 men. German defenders noticed what was happening. Interrogation reports from this period show a consistent theme. Bunker crews understood their tactical position and intended to exploit it. One captured Feldwebel from a fortress battalion told his interrogators that morale had improved dramatically once his unit occupied prepared positions. "In the open, we were dead men," he said. "Behind concrete, we could fight." The Germans weren't wrong. Physics favored the defense. American tactical doctrine assumed mobile warfare, maneuver, firepower applied at decisive points. None of that worked when the enemy sat in hardened positions designed specifically to neutralize those advantages. By late September, frontline commanders had stopped requesting artillery preparation against pillboxes and stopped sending bazooka teams on suicide missions. Nobody pretended anymore that the problem would solve itself through bravery or better planning. What they started requesting, in increasing volume and urgency, was engineers, not for bridging or road clearance, for bunker assault. Someone, somewhere, had to have something that could crack these things open, because rifle companies advancing into embrasure fire was not a strategy. It was a meat grinder with Wehrmacht serial numbers stamped on the handle. The field notebook measures 4 inches by 6, spiral-bound, water-stained along one edge. It belongs to Captain Ernest Gruning, an engineer officer attached to the 1st Infantry Division, and the entry dated September 23, 1944, contains a sketch that would change how American units approached every pillbox on the Siegfried Line. The drawing shows a Regelbau Type 10 bunker from above, a simple rectangle with the aperture marked on one wall. Radiating from that aperture, Gruning drew 2 lines at roughly 45-degree angles, extending outward to show the machine gun's field of fire. Then he shaded everything outside those lines. The label reads, "Dead ground, approach zone." The aperture that made bunkers so lethal also made them blind. An MG-42 mounted in a fixed emplacement could traverse maybe 90 degrees. Some installations allowed slightly more, some less, depending on how the Germans had built the internal mount. But physics imposed limits. The gun barrel needed clearance to swing. The gunner needed to see his targets. The concrete walls on either side of the slit blocked both motion and vision beyond certain angles. Directly behind the bunker, and for a significant arc on either flank, the crew inside could see nothing, could hit nothing, could do nothing except listen. Gruning wasn't the only engineer to notice this. Once American units started capturing intact pillboxes instead of just dying in front of them, the pattern became obvious. The bunkers all had rear aspects facing away from expected attack routes, walls thick enough to block sound and vision from behind. Their crews operated with a fundamental assumption: the enemy would come from the front, where the gun pointed. German defensive doctrine reinforced this assumption. Bunkers were sited to provide interlocking fire across approach routes. Position A covered the ground in front of Position B, and vice versa. The system assumed mutual support. If Americans tried to flank one bunker, another bunker's field of fire would cut them down. What the doctrine didn't account for was an attacker who could get behind the entire belt, or one who didn't need to get far behind, just far enough to exit the embrasure's arc. Engineer officers started mapping approach routes in October. The work was tedious and dangerous. Someone had to crawl close enough to a bunker to estimate its firing arc, mark the terrain features that provided cover into the dead zone, and get back out without being killed. The calculations weren't precise. 5 degrees of error could mean the difference between concealment and a machine gun burst, but they were better than nothing. Better than sending rifle squads straight into the teeth. What emerged from this mapping was a tactical blueprint. Suppress the bunker from the front. You didn't need to destroy it, just keep the crew's heads down and their aperture pointed at the distraction. Meanwhile, a small team works around the flank, using terrain, smoke, whatever cover exists, until they reach that shaded zone in Gruning's notebook. Once inside the dead ground, the bunker crew becomes irrelevant. They can't engage what they can't see. The problem, of course, was what happened next. Reaching the dead zone solved one problem and created another. Now you stood behind a concrete box containing armed men who knew you were out there. The walls were still 4 feet thick. The steel door was still locked from inside. The ventilation shafts, small, high on the structure, angled to prevent grenade insertion, offered no obvious vulnerability. Infantry could reach the blind spot and then do precisely nothing with the advantage. Standard demolitions couldn't solve this. A satchel charge against the rear wall would gouge concrete and accomplish little else. The door might crack under enough TNT, but enough meant pounds of explosive placed at close range, while other bunkers in the belt targeted the demo team. You could stand in perfect safety behind a bunker and still have no way to kill the men inside. Engineers needed a tool that didn't require brute force, one that could bypass the concrete entirely. The Germans had never planned for it. 47 rounds. That's how many a 3-inch M10 tank destroyer could carry into combat. Against panzers in open country, that number worked. Against a belt of fortifications, where each bunker might require multiple hits just to suppress, not destroy, suppress, the math turned ugly fast. But suppression was the point. The tactical integration started crystallizing in early October, and it looked nothing like textbook doctrine. An M10 would crawl forward under cover, a tree line, a fold in the terrain, smoke if nothing else worked, until it reached a firing position, maybe 300 yards from the target bunker. Close enough for accuracy, far enough that return fire from the embrasure couldn't penetrate the tank destroyer's frontal armor. Then the gun fired, not aiming for that impossible 8 by 16-inch slot, aiming at the concrete around it. The concussion inside a pillbox when a 76-millimeter round detonates against the exterior wall 2 feet from your head. The after-action reports describe crews stumbling, ears bleeding, vision blurred. The round didn't penetrate, didn't need to. It turned the bunker into a bell and the men inside into clappers. 1 round rattled them. 3 rounds in quick succession left them unable to see their own aperture clearly, let alone engage targets through it. The suppression bought maybe 30 seconds before the crew recovered enough to resume accurate fire. 30 seconds for a 4-man engineer team to cross 50 yards of open ground. The machine guns handled the connecting trenches. Every bunker complex had them. Communication trenches linking positions, allowing German infantry to reinforce or counterattack. A .30 caliber air-cooled Browning couldn't touch concrete, but it could keep heads down in a 6-foot-deep trench. 2 guns, traversing in overlapping arcs, created a wall of steel that made movement above ground level suicidal for anyone trying to reach the targeted bunker. Staff Sergeant William Purcell ran this drill outside Aachen on October 8th. The smell hit him first. Burnt propellant from the M10's gun mixed with the wet earth stink of churned soil and something chemical he couldn't identify. His team sprinted while the tank destroyer worked. 1 round, 2. The 3rd round struck and Purcell saw dust cascade from the bunker's roof, debris showering down the concrete slope. They reached the dead zone. 4 men pressed against the rear wall of a structure designed to kill them, breathing hard, listening to the Brownings chatter somewhere behind them. Inside, the German crew knew someone was out there. The firing had stopped, the M10 conserving ammunition, now that suppression had served its purpose, but the bunker's aperture pointed the wrong direction. The MG-42 couldn't traverse far enough to engage targets directly behind the structure. The crew had pistols, grenades, whatever personal weapons they'd brought. None of it mattered against 4 feet of their own concrete. Purcell's men carried no rifles. Standard infantry weapons would have been dead weight. They carried something else entirely. Equipment that weighed 40 pounds per man and required no ammunition in the conventional sense. The clock was running. Other bunkers in the belt would be adjusting, trying to bring fire onto the exposed American position. The machine guns couldn't suppress everything forever. German mortar crews, if any survived the preliminary bombardment, would be walking rounds toward the commotion. 30 seconds to reach the wall. Maybe another 60 before supporting fire became untenable. Purcell's team had practiced this. Not enough. Nobody had practiced fortification assault enough before September. But the motions were becoming automatic. 1 man watched the flanks. 1 prepped the equipment. 2 positioned themselves at the ventilation shaft. A 12-inch pipe angled 45 degrees into the bunker's interior. The Germans had designed those shafts to defeat grenades. The angle meant a thrown frag would bounce back out. The diameter was too small for a satchel charge, but the shaft still connected the outside air to the inside air. Function and fatal flaw, both. The pole charge weighs 11 pounds and extends 12 feet when assembled. Canvas-wrapped TNT blocks lashed to a wooden shaft with a friction igniter at the base and a 4-second delay. Purcell's demo man slots the sections together with hands that don't shake, not because he isn't scared, but because the motion has become mechanical, practiced in rear areas on mock-ups that never shot back. 4 seconds. That's the delay after you pull the igniter. 4 seconds to place the charge against the door, step back, cover your ears, and hope you counted right. The bunker's steel door sits recessed into the concrete, 18 inches deep in its frame. Standard Westwall construction. The recess creates a channel that focuses blast inward rather than dispersing it across the wall surface. The Germans built it that way to protect the door from artillery fragments. They hadn't considered what happens when an American puts the explosive inside that channel deliberately. Purcell hears the M10 fire again, 1 round, then silence. The tank destroyer is conserving ammunition for the next bunker in the line. His window is closing. The demo man pulls the igniter. Purcell watches him count, lips moving, no sound, and place the pole charge against the door frame at a 45-degree angle. The canvas-wrapped blocks nestle into the recess like they were designed for it, which, in a way, they were. The friction fuse hisses, a sound like wet wood on a fire, barely audible over the distant Browning fire. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. The blast doesn't register as sound. It registers as pressure, a fist against the chest, dust and fragments scattering past Purcell's position, around the bunker's corner. His ears ring. His vision blurs at the edges. When he looks back, the door is gone. Not blown open. Gone. Twisted metal scattered across the interior floor, visible through the smoking gap. The crew inside has maybe 3 seconds to process what just happened. They've spent the last 90 seconds listening to shells pound their front wall, ears bleeding, world reduced to concussion and noise. Now the rear door. The door that was supposed to be safe, that faced away from the enemy, that connected to the trench network they couldn't reach because machine guns swept every inch of open ground. That door just ceased to exist. Purcell's team doesn't wait for the smoke to clear. 2 men through the gap, pistols drawn, flashlights mounted on the barrels. The interior of a Regelbau bunker measures roughly 12 feet by 20. Concrete walls, concrete ceiling, concrete floor. An MG-42 on its mount, barrel still pointed toward the front aperture. 3 Germans on the floor, 1 not moving, 2 crawling toward weapons they'll never reach. The fight ends in 6 seconds. Outside, the Brownings fall silent. The suppression is no longer necessary. Somewhere to the north, another M10 is moving into position for the next bunker in the sequence. The drill will repeat. Suppression, approach, dead zone, breach, clear. The captured Germans don't look like the photographs in American magazines. They look like men who've been trapped in a concrete box while someone beat on the walls with a hammer. Dust cakes their uniforms. Blood runs from ears, from noses. Their eyes track the American flashlights with the glazed confusion of trauma victims. One keeps repeating something. Purcell doesn't speak German, doesn't need to. The tone says enough. 3 men. That's what the bunker held. 3 men and a machine gun that killed God knows how many Americans over the previous weeks. Purcell's team neutralized it in under 3 minutes with equipment that cost less than a single artillery shell. The MG-42 sits on its mount, barrel still warm. Purcell looks at it for a long moment. 8 inches by 16. All that death delivered through a slot the size of a shoebox lid. His men are already stripping the gun, pocketing the bolt, marking the position for follow-on forces. The bunker is American now. The concrete that protected Germans will protect Americans while they assault the next position in line. Nobody comments on that. Nobody laughs either. The decision to surrender happens before the door blows. That's the part American after-action reports don't capture well. They document the breach, the entry, the 6 seconds of violence inside. What they miss is the 60 seconds before, the window when German crews had to choose between fighting and dying, or giving up and maybe living. For most, the choice was already made by the time the pole charge detonated. Inside the bunker, the crew has been taking fire against their front wall for 90 seconds. Each 76mm impact shakes the structure, rattles teeth, sends dust cascading from the ceiling. The noise inside a concrete box when high explosives detonate 2 feet away. Survivors described it as physical assault, sound so loud, it stopped being sound and became pressure. Vision blurred, balance failed. Men vomited from the disorientation. Then, the shelling stops, not gradually, abruptly. One moment the bunker is being hammered, the next, silence. Relative silence anyway. The MG-42 gunner tries to blink his vision clear, tries to find targets through the aperture he's been manning for hours. His ears ring, his hands shake from the concussion. He sees nothing. The Americans who were advancing, where did they go? Someone outside the bunker coughs. The sound comes from the wrong direction. From behind. From the dead zone where no enemy should be. Where the door connects to the trench network that's supposed to be friendly territory. The gunner tries to traverse his weapon, and the mount stops him cold. 90 degrees maximum, and the sound came from 180. Now the crew knows. Men are standing behind 4 feet of their own concrete, and the MG-42 that killed so many Americans over the past weeks has become useless. A 15-kilogram doorstop pointed the wrong way. German bunker crews carried Walther P-38 pistols, sometimes MP-40 submachine guns, occasionally grenades, personal weapons for personal defense. The training assumption was that these would be used if enemy infantry somehow breached the door, a scenario doctrine considered unlikely because the door faced away from the enemy. You'd shoot attackers as they funneled through the narrow opening, one at a time, fish in a barrel. The training never covered what happens when the enemy doesn't come through the door, when the enemy brings the door to you. Captured Germans described the next 30 seconds as the longest of their lives. They could hear movement outside, footsteps on concrete, metallic sounds they couldn't identify, voices speaking English in tones too quiet to make out words. Some crews tried to organize resistance, one man watching the door with a pistol, another positioned at the ventilation shaft, a third ready to throw a grenade through the aperture at any Americans still in the front arc. Most didn't manage even that. The concussion from the suppression fire had left them barely functional, half deaf and half blind, nauseated, shaking. Some couldn't stand. Others couldn't remember where they'd put their pistols. The Westwall was supposed to protect them. Instead, it had become a trap. The hiss of a friction fuse carries through concrete. That's the sound that ended resistance in bunker after bunker, not the explosion itself, the warning. 4 seconds of knowing exactly what was about to happen and being completely unable to stop it. Some crews spent those 4 seconds diving for cover. Others spent them screaming. A few, the ones who'd been through this before, who'd watched other bunkers fall to the same technique, spent them throwing down weapons and shouting surrender through the aperture. The engineers outside couldn't hear the shouting. The charge detonated anyway. Word spread through German defensive positions faster than official communications could explain it. Bunker crews started surrendering the moment they heard Americans behind them. Not after the door blew, but before. The psychological calculation was simple. Fight, and you die in a concrete box. Surrender, and you might see 1945. The men emerging from those bunkers didn't look like soldiers. They looked like survivors of something that had nothing to do with combat, as they'd been trained to understand it. The interrogation form measures 8 inches by 11, standard Army issue, carbon copied in triplicate. The one dated October 12, 1944, contains a handwritten note in the margin that no typist would reproduce. Subject unclear why we are surprised. The prisoner was Gefreiter Hans Wohlgemuth, 23 years old, formerly of the 344th Infantry Division's bunker garrison near Aachen. He'd held his position under American artillery bombardment for 6 hours on October 9th. 173 rounds struck within 50 meters of his bunker. Not one penetrated. His MG-42 killed 7 Americans that morning. The count came from his own tally marks, scratched into the concrete beside the aperture. He surrendered 90 seconds after hearing footsteps behind the bunker. The interrogating officer wanted to know why. Wohlgemuth gave him an answer that appears in 3 separate transcripts from that week, almost word for word. The bunker faces forward. I face forward. Everything faces forward. He didn't understand why this required explanation. Artillery, infantry, tanks, everything comes from in front. The bunker exists to engage threats from the front. When the threat materialized from behind, Wolgemut's training offered no response. His weapon couldn't traverse. His aperture pointed the wrong direction. His door, the door, opened onto what should have been friendly territory. The American rifle companies watching these surrenders couldn't process what they were seeing. Private First Class Anthony Marchetti, 26th Infantry Regiment, described the scene in a letter home that Army censors let pass. "We'd been getting chewed up by this pillbox for 3 days, lost 8 guys trying different approaches. Then the engineers show up with their gear, spend maybe 5 minutes doing whatever they do, and suddenly there's Krauts walking out with their hands up. I wanted to shoot every one of them. Then I saw their faces, and I didn't want to anymore." The faces told the story the interrogation forms couldn't capture. Dust-caked, blood streaking from ears and noses, eyes tracking movement with the glazed confusion of men who'd suffered repeated concussive trauma. They walked like drunks. Some couldn't walk at all and had to be carried by the engineers who just destroyed their position. 3 days of artillery hadn't broken them. 5 minutes of tactical geometry had. The after-action reports from 1st Infantry Division's Engineer Battalion contain a statistical anomaly that took weeks to explain. Bunkers that surrendered before breach, crews who came out the moment they heard Americans behind them, showed casualty rates near zero. Bunkers that resisted until the pole charge detonated showed casualty rates above 60%. The 6-second fight inside a 12 by 20 concrete room rarely produced survivors on the defending side. Word traveled. By late October, some bunker crews had developed an informal protocol. When the suppression fire stopped and footsteps sounded behind the structure, one man would shout through the aperture in whatever English he knew. Kamerad worked. So did "don't shoot." So did throwing a white undershirt through the firing slit. The engineers couldn't always hear it. The riflemen watching from 200 yards back certainly couldn't. From their perspective, a bunker that had shrugged off everything thrown at it for days would suddenly disgorge Germans who'd apparently decided that today, specifically, was the day to quit. The geometry explanation never made it into the press releases. What made it into the press was simpler. American engineers had cracked the Siegfried Line. The implication was technical superiority, better explosives, smarter tactics, all true as far as it went. But the surrenders weren't really about explosives or tactics. They were about a defensive doctrine that assumed the enemy would always come from one direction. The Germans had built 20,000 bunkers facing west. Every firing slit, every MG mount, every meter of interlocking fields of fire, all oriented toward France. The possibility that Americans might simply walk around to the back and knock hadn't factored into the engineering. Wolgemut's interrogation form ends with a question the officer apparently asked out of curiosity. "Did you consider repositioning your weapon to cover the rear entrance?" The answer, translated: "With what time? With what mount? The gun weighs 15 kilograms. The door was already gone." Combined arms doctrine had been gospel in Army field manuals since 1942. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, each element performing its specialized function in coordination with the others. Staff officers drew elegant diagrams showing how the pieces fit together. Training exercises practiced the choreography. Then units hit actual combat, and the diagrams fell apart because coordination required radios that worked, officers who understood each other's capabilities, time that nobody had, and luck besides. The Siegfried Line assault teams worked anyway. The officers who should have expected this seemed surprised. A First Army operations officer wrote in his November summary that the bunker reduction method functioned as designed despite field conditions that would normally degrade coordination to zero. His word, normally. The implication being that combined arms usually failed under pressure. Simplicity made the difference. The M10 didn't need to talk to the engineers. It needed to fire at one target until the engineers reached the dead zone, then stop. The engineers didn't need to coordinate with the riflemen. They needed to breach the door while the riflemen stayed out of the blast radius. Each element had one job: sequence, not synchronization. The training pipeline adapted within weeks. Engineer replacement depots added pole charge assembly to the standard curriculum. Tank destroyer crews practiced the suppression drill, sustained fire against a single point, counting rounds, conserving ammunition for the next target. Infantry platoons learned to identify dead zones from 200 yards back and mark them for approaching engineers. The method spread faster than orders could travel. A 1st Division staff officer noted in a post-war interview, "Units that hadn't received formal instruction were already doing it because someone in the next battalion over had explained how it worked." By December 1944, variations had emerged for different bunker types. Larger structures with multiple apertures required 2 M10s firing in alternation. Bunkers connected by underground passages needed blocking positions to prevent crews from escaping into adjacent fortifications. Some engineer teams started carrying thermite grenades in addition to pole charges. Useful for welding apertures shut when taking prisoners wasn't the priority. The Germans tried to adapt. Field modifications appeared on bunkers along the remaining Westwall sections. Extra firing slits cut into rear walls, trenches dug to provide covered approaches to back doors, machine gun positions oriented to sweep the dead zones. Most of these modifications arrived too late. By the time engineers reached a given sector, the crews inside were already operating under the original design constraints. Concrete doesn't reconfigure quickly. Casualty figures told part of the story. Engineer battalions attacking fortified positions in October 44 lost men at roughly 1/3 the rate of infantry battalions attempting the same objectives without engineer support. The men carrying pole charges and satchel charges were safer than the men carrying rifles. Not because their job was less dangerous, but because the system around them eliminated dangers before they materialized. The Westwall didn't fall to superior firepower. American artillery couldn't crack those bunkers, and everyone knew it. American armor couldn't survive the approach, and the burned-out Shermans proved it. The line cracked because someone started treating each fortification as a geometry problem rather than a firepower problem. Suppress the front, walk the dead ground, breach the rear, clear the interior. The technique would appear again in the Pacific, modified for Japanese positions that shared the Westwall's fundamental flaw: forward-facing defensive works with vulnerable rear approaches. Engineers who'd learned the method in Germany applied it to Okinawa without significant modification. On the morning of October 15, 1944, Sergeant Purcell's team finished clearing their 3rd bunker before noon. They reloaded the pole charge components into their canvas bags, topped off canteens from a water can someone had brought forward, and started walking toward the next position in the line. Half a mile north, an M10 was already moving into firing position.